Good morning. It's Wednesday, April 30th at 9:04 a.m. This is your House Committee on Commerce and Economic Development, and we're here today to get this morning to have a report on the Municipal Technical Assistance Program. And so we have here with us Doug Farnham, Chief Recovery Officer of the Officer of Agency Administration. Good morning.
Good morning.
So what do you have for us?
So for the record, Douglas Farnham, Chief Recovery Officer. I would start with a quick background on the program context. So the Municipal Technical Assistance Program was created in the 2023 Budget Adjustment Act. And it was $3 million of general fund that were allocated to assist with communities which score highly on the Vermont Community Index, which is something the agency created, which evaluates the capacity of a municipality versus the need. So it takes socioeconomic factors like those in the Social Vulnerability Index, and it compares them to the grand list capacity, the tax rate, the number of administrative staff a community has. It tries to look at, okay, what does your community need at a high level, which is the main purpose of the Social Vulnerability Index, and compares it to, okay, how likely are you to be able to meet those needs on your own? A factor in it, of course, is community size. So smaller communities do tend to rate higher on the scale, but for instance, Barrie, which is one of the larger communities in the state, is in the 30s. So it's much higher than other communities of its size because of the socioeconomic factors in Barrie City. So the idea was to provide tiered support preference to those towns that had the highest scores, and to help them move forward projects that were in the housing, water and sewer, climate change mitigation, and 4 or 5 major categories along those lines. And those categories were designed to line up with the American Rescue Plan Act state fiscal recovery funds, which $1.049 billion was rolling out and is still rolling out with a deadline of 12/31/2026. So we still have a year and 3/4 or so to spend the remaining funds in those programs. Also, the Inflation Reduction Act and the Investment in Infrastructure and Jobs Act. So 3 federal packages, essentially, that were once in a generation levels of one-time program funding were created, and roughly at the same time. Of course, ARPA was first, and then IIJA, or bill, bipartisan infrastructure law, and then the Inflation Reduction Act. And so the intent and the urgency in 2023 was, let's get this program established. Let's help these towns participate. Because at the time, I was the deputy secretary of the Agency of Administration, and I was overseeing the pandemic programs as well as other normal deputy secretary stuff, signing paperwork and whatnot. Quick sequester. When I spoke to my 10-year-old son at the time, he thought that my job was filing paperwork, basically, in a filing cabinet. So I thought that was cute. But a lot of administrative oversight, generally just keeping government kind of running in a rational, normal manner, and signing waivers for people that want to do things a little differently. So when we created the MTAP program, the executive came to the legislature with the request. The legislature responded and helped create the program. It was intended to drum up more projects in those smaller communities, because we were monitoring the applications, monitoring who was getting approved projects through our various programs. And we were seeing a pretty clear bias towards the more prepared, larger communities. And not just in the dollar amount, but also in the number of projects, right? Bigger communities are going to have more expensive projects. That's just how infrastructure works, right? But we were seeing those numbers shifted in both ways, right? More projects and more money proportionally going to those communities. So we knew we wouldn't be able to completely change the trajectory, because it takes years to get some of these projects moving. But the interesting thing about MTAP that makes it different than most other technical assistance efforts that the state or the federal government runs is that it's in these broader categories. So if it's a housing project, we'll help. If it's a water project, we'll help. If it's climate change related, we'll help you figure that out. And that one's it can be kind of squishy. And that one usually requires a lot more conversation to figure out, okay, what is this actual project and why are you doing it? But for smallest communities, it ends up being a lot of times an older historic structure in the town that they're converting into an emergency shelter. Somewhere that is outside of the floodplain, somewhere that's relatively resilient. They want to put generators in. They want to give people a safe place to go in an emergency. And with changing weather patterns, that to us qualified as climate mitigation strategies. Also, if they want to plan on how to work on their roads, as long as they're looking at their roads in the context of how can we make these less likely to be damaged in the future, then that's what we're interested in. If they're just trying to repave, not so much. Sidewalk projects, we got a lot of requests for that, not so much. So we went out, we engaged with the towns that were highest on the index, and we did find that the towns that were and this is in 2023, we engaged in the spring of 2023 after it was passed in the BAA. So we worked with the regional planning commissions, engaged with a quarter of the towns in the state, the ones that were highest on the index. And what we found was there weren't that many projects in that category that those communities wanted to do. So part of it was a selection bias, that the programs that we as a state had created with ARPA, which are very, I think, smart and well-balanced investments as a portfolio from the statewide perspective, they weren't necessarily what these communities were looking to do at the time, or just in general. Some communities are fine where they are and aren't really looking to invest further in infrastructure or put in more housing, which is, creating a lot of challenges around the state, right? The lack of housing. So we doubled down on engaging with those communities, tried to find out, okay, well, what projects do you want to do, right? And where their project made sense in one of those buckets, we were able to help them move those projects forward. But there really was a very real difference in direction between the general direction of investment of infrastructure funds in the state and what some of these smaller communities wanted to do, which was a lot of time it was about protecting historic structures, churches, graveyards, like really maintaining the character of their existing things, not necessarily adding on to it, but preserving what they have already had. And that's just not what any of the three major federal vehicles focused on. So there are no unique or exceptional opportunities in that area at the federal level. So we as a state didn't invest in helping towns go out and find those because they don't really exist right now. So we were successful after, and then the flood happened in 2023. I was appointed to the Chief Recovery Officer role, which continued to maintain oversight over pandemic, but also on flood recovery now. And MTAP, the Municipal Technical Assistance, crosses over and blends in with flood recovery quite a bit. So we had to pause for several months and then reboot in the fall of 2023. And that's when we re-engaged. We gave towns a deadline at the end of the calendar year. And then we got the full list of projects to flush out the $3 million that was appropriated in 2023. What we learned from that as well is that the towns where, with our assistance, they were able to engage and were able to start participating more in the programs, it was in the 50% to 75% bracket of the Vermont Community Index. So what that ends up looking like most of the time are, for Vermont, small to medium-sized communities, 1,000 to 2,500 range. And when I'm talking to A&R a lot of the time about water systems, which I do a lot, actually, towns under 1,000, generally, it doesn't make sense for them to have a municipal water system, right? And it's very difficult for communities to cross those thresholds where it doesn't necessarily make sense yet. There's not necessarily an economy of scale. There's not enough users for the system. Even the town of Johnson, the village of Johnson that runs their wastewater or their water system, has barely enough users to support a viable structure. So many of our towns in Vermont hit that reality of even if they got the funds to build something, it wouldn't be feasible to maintain it in the long term because there just aren't enough users to generate that low enough rates for the use. So we did have some success identifying projects and supporting projects in the 75 to 100, the highest priority section, but a bigger chunk of our projects came from the 50 to 75 group. And then after the floods, we did allow for towns down to 25% on the index if they were flood impacted, which was a large number of communities in the state. The 2023 floods impacted about 150 communities. Not as widespread of an impact as Tropical Storm Irene, but more focused where in some places. Although Tropical Storm Irene obviously had some massive focus damage in plenty of places. So by the spring of 2024, we had locked in our project list, and half of the $3 million, a little over half, is for the regional planning commissions and was dedicated to a list of projects where the regional planning commissions went out, talked about a potential project, figured out how they could help a community move it forward, whether it was in the very early ideation phase or whether they're trying to actually figure out state permits, or whether they've already got a federal grant and they're looking for help moving that project forward and administering the grant. And about 40% of it, the agency of administration, being the we in this case, put out through grants to the Preservation Trust of Vermont, VHCB's Rural Economic Development Initiative, which does grant writing support, with the Vermont Council on Rural Development. We did a very small contract with Stone Environmental to be able to provide hydrology or environmental assessments to specific projects, just 200,000 of the 3 million for that purpose, so that we can kind of direct a qualified expert at a specific project when it's needed. And the Vermont League of Cities and Towns to give broad, high-level technical support to the communities that qualify, but also to help us coordinate and help us make sure, we're not being Abbott and Costello out there, a lot of players. But part of the idea was, instead of pushing just the traditional regional planning commission funds out through the traditional channels, was to put this different layer on it, to bring in more players, to make it a little bit more competitive. So we did RFP and tried to establish contracts. But honestly, Stone was the only viable contract we got. So one of the theories we wanted the program to test was that there wasn't that much help out there in the private sector for communities that were looking to do this type of work. And I think, unfortunately, that proved true, that there just aren't that many companies operating in Vermont that can help a town when they're looking for help. And that's why they generally end up, if they have funds, going to the regional planning commissions for support there. So after the 2024 floods, we at AOA opened up the eligibility for flood impacted communities in 2024 only for ad hoc work, meaning $10,000 to $20,000 or less of work, just help figuring out where you need to go, but not sustained project support, because our budget was already essentially locked in. But we let mostly the regional planning commissions and the Council on Rural Development go out and just help communities figure out, okay, what do we do now, right? Just have those initial conversations of what direction they need to go with, and trying to be very clear with people. We can help you for a little bit, but we don't have the funds to provide ongoing support. And so that ad hoc support, we still have to tally all of that up. But again, it was very limited in the amount of each, so it shouldn't cause too much overall budget disruption. But that is one of the reasons behind so there's two main reasons for the budget request for MTAP that was in the GovRec budget this year. One was just so that we'd be able to reconcile that budget impact from the ad hoc work we did after the floods. If possible, we'd like to avoid reducing any of the longer term agreements we made. But most of that work in MTAP is still happening and will still happen over the next year or two. So adjustments can be made. It's just nice if you don't have to make adjustments, right? And then the other part of the 3 million was the regional planning commissions, when we solicited those projects in 2020, late 2023 and early 2024, came up with a list of another 1.5 million of potential projects. So specific projects of qualifying towns that with some support could move forward, and all in the categories. Looking at that list, there's probably a couple on there that I wouldn't be able to support, but it started at 1.5, and it's generally a pretty good list of viable projects that line up with the state's goals. So that's the general landscape. And I know I talked to it for a while there, and sorry for that.
Is that a list that is there one list someplace? Where is that list?
So we have the unfunded project list in Excel spreadsheet. I shared it with House Appropriations when I testified in there. I can send it over after this. We have a spreadsheet, and we have a spreadsheet with a tab that shows all the projects that MTAP did support through the regional planning commissions, and a tab that has all the unfunded projects for the regional planning commissions. What that doesn't capture very well is all of the engagement work and the project work happening through the other partners, because then they tend to go into a town and help them figure out what they want to do. That doesn't always result in a specific project, right? And sometimes it can take 4 or 5 sessions before they have a list of potential projects. A good example of that, Johnson. MTAP funds were used to support the community discussion process in Johnson, and the Vermont Council on Rural Development went in and did multiple sessions to help that town talk about, okay, what do we really want to do? We're faced with a difficult situation. Our municipal infrastructure is not in a great place right now. And what can we reasonably and practically do to move away from this situation?
Do you expect there to be at the conclusion of FY25 an annual report for MTAP, or is there still reporting ongoing for MTAP, and things that are informing your testimony today that would be available for you, or do those already exist?
So we were charged with producing, I think it was 3 reports related to MTAP. They were all pretty quick, pretty short, because it was intended to be rapid. And I think we launched it roughly in line with expectations. So those formal report requirements are complete. We wouldn't produce more reports at this point because the funds have been allocated, the work is happening. But unless we get more funding, there won't be any change from prior reports, really, any significant change.
So what exists on the MTAP pages, that's all the information that we're sort of gleaning here.
That page has the high level reports. It doesn't have the unfunded project list. We didn't want to put that up there, but we're happy to share the unfunded project list. And if we do get additional funds, it would be perfectly reasonable to have reporting requirements built into that.
Could you remind us what the budget request is for the additional funds?
The budget request is $3 million. That did not make it through the House version of the budget. A lot of competing priorities, so I understand. We do still think it's a smart investment of money, and the Senate at this point has restored 1 million of funding for the program. They have, at this point, it's funded from the pilot fund, which is generated by local option taxes. A portion of local option taxes goes to generate to seed that fund, and its pilot is payment in lieu of taxes. It's generally used to reimburse towns for that have state properties that aren't able to charge property tax on that. So the use of pilot as a funding source adds a little bit of complexity and a little bit of controversy around that, because the towns that generate local option tax generally are not the towns that it's not a 1-for-1, but it's nearly 1-for-1 that they're not the same towns that need technical assistance and that are getting this support. So I think the league has complicated has a complicated perspective on using the pilot funds to fund MTAP. And I've been talking to them a bit, but the administration would prefer that the funding didn't come from pilot, of course. But I can also see why the connection was made. This is a municipal use. The pilot fund should be used for municipal purposes only. And I think the real policy debate that hasn't happened, that should, is that pilot fund is generated by certain municipalities. But what does the state, the General Assembly, really feel appropriate uses of excess receipts from that fund are? Should it go back to the towns that generated it, or should it go to a broader use that serves municipalities? Because we don't have a lot of sources that are dedicated as municipal sources. And I think the intent from the creation of that fund back to Act 60, I think it was created with Act 60 with the gold towns. Pilot may have existed before then, but the local option tax was anchored to Act 60. And I think that's a policy question that I think I would have been involved if it happened by now. So I don't think it's really happened at this point, and it would be a good one.
Thanks very much. It was kind of good to get a picture of where the status of the budget stuff doesn't look too encouraging, but thanks for bringing that to our attention. I think you mentioned something about public improvements. And so is the technical assistance? Well, yeah, I guess it is. It's directly related to helping towns, but is the object of that assistance only, publicly owned infrastructure? Or is it also, private infrastructure that might, I'm thinking of some of those really smaller towns.
Mhm.
Is that an option, or has that been considered as an option to maybe entice some of these towns who don't see the need or don't want to get involved with public infrastructure, but do see a need? I'm thinking about trailer parks. I'm thinking about other sort of communities, rural communities that might need some help in terms of their infrastructure. And how does that fit in with the program?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it is one we had to grapple with pretty early on, because especially in smaller communities where they have no professional resources, and I'm not trying to criticize select boards or clerks or anyone who's elected, that they're elected officials, right? And so their backgrounds can be widely varied. Some of them have a professional background in what they're elected to do. Some of them are just trying to help out and trying to keep the town on a good direction, right? But generally, they don't have a lot of these towns don't have any paid staff. So if something happens in that community, it often happens through like local nonprofits that are stood up. So what we did do with the program is, and I don't think this ended up being the predominating relationship, but we allowed it, was as long as the town sponsored the project and it was a qualifying project, then we would allow for support to go to a nonprofit, or I don't think any businesses got really involved with any of this stuff, but there were some like community nonprofits that wanted to work with the town and had a project that the town wanted to see go forward. But we were very careful to say, because communities can be fractured in Vermont.
Yeah.
And so we said, you guys can have, I know, newsflash, right? Where it's like, we have to work with one person as the voice of the community, and that's the select board. That, we're going through the town. If the town approves your project and says they'll want to apply on your behalf, which was a very, very simple application. Basically, yes, was the application process if they qualified. Then we would work with that nonprofit or that other partner.
Yeah, so you mentioned nonprofits. Yeah, that helps in terms of how it works. Then that would help some of these manufactured home parks that my towns have, well, quite a few. Some of those, though, aren't really a manufactured home park, but they might be a development where they have a community septic system, community road system that might have either been affected by the floods or for some other reason have, need help. But they're actually owned by, say, that association of homeowners or whatever. Is that the type of project? I mean, setting aside the funding issues, is that the type of project that could benefit as long as the municipality endorses it?
As long as the municipality endorsed it, yes.
Okay.
I don't think I'd have to go through the list, but I don't believe we had any manufactured home communities. I would say one thing I have, especially in my flood recovery role, observed is if you want to get into complicated, look at the relationship between manufactured home communities and the local government and other elements of the communities in these towns, right? Some towns are very supportive and look at those as just any other resident. Other towns, I got some pretty nasty feedback on one program where we were trying to help people in manufactured homes. They're like, we don't want those. We don't want people. We don't want more of those. What are you doing? You're trying to ruin Vermont. And that was unfortunate, right?
Housing is housing.
Housing is housing.
Right.
It also helps that modern manufactured homes are now getting to the point where they can actually receive a mortgage. One of the programs I worked on with the governor's staff, it kind of pushed for and found local lenders that would give mortgages to allow people to buy those homes. And it really comes down to the depreciation and how they hold up. And they're now holding up long enough that they don't have to be treated as personal property anymore. But yes, I think a couple of our ARPA state fiscal recovery programs, the Healthy Homes program in particular, focused on helping with wastewater issues in those communities. And they've been extremely helpful, not only in a health and safety issue, but just making those communities more attractive and able to support more households.
Are you able to talk a little bit about the status of some of the ARPA
Yes.
piece?
Yes, absolutely. One of my flaws is that I'm able to talk about most things. So if I get a little windy,
We know the feeling.
yeah, if I get a little windy, please rein me in. So with the American Rescue Plan Act, the 1.049 billion, roughly 70% of that was dedicated to these infrastructure style programs, right? Water and sewer was a big lane, housing, major investment through Vermont Housing Conservation Board and other programs. And so that was a smart investment. I'm extremely happy that the legislature and the governor agreed on, didn't agree on all the details, but agreed on a pretty smart split and deployment of those funds. If you compare it to how other states used it, I feel like we were in the lead of the pack as far as rationality and a plan goes to deploying those to good effect. The problem with infrastructure, of course, especially in Vermont, is that it takes time. Our construction season is not great. Our permitting and requirements for some very valid philosophical reasons are complicated and time consuming. And so the risk with us for ARPA was getting all of that work done by 12/31/2026. So one of my jobs starting from when I was deputy secretary was to monitor the progress on those programs, make sure they were still moving forward, make sure they were on a trend to spend enough to deplete in time and not send anything back, because we want to spend the money intelligently. But of course, even before that, we don't want to send any of it back to the feds. So the first major deadline that came up recently was the 12/31/2024. So just this last December, all of that money had to be obligated in a grant contract or memorandum of understanding between agencies to every last penny of it, or the Treasury would recapture it. So that was a very hard deadline. Treasury sent out notifications. They were very serious about that. We did get everything obligated. So Vermont cleared that gate. The other element of it, spending all of the money before 12/31/2026 and looking at projections of how we were moving, and particularly in those infrastructure programs that take longer to stand up and take longer to deploy the funds, we were not on pace to spend all that money by 12/31/2026. So last year, the Agency of Administration asked for the authority, and the legislature was kind enough to grant it, to do net neutral transfers for any ARPA program where we took the money from the ARPA program. So we take 10 million from an ARPA program. We look at that money and we apply it to the lowest risk usage from the Treasury rule that we can. And that used two main categories: the revenue loss category, where states were allowed to basically use the money for almost anything they'd normally use it for. So that was a very easy category to find. And most of what we did with the revenue loss category was the payments to higher education, VSAC, the state colleges, and UVM. That was a big lump sum payment. The money was out the door. We know it's not coming back. So we were able to classify a lot of our revenue loss money on those payments to those higher education institutions. And that got the money formally expended from Treasury's perspective. So we did that for about $160 million in December of 2024. We wanted to protect it from any potential recapture. So as far as the feds are concerned, in December, we spent a little over 200 million. The other 60 million or so, 60 to 80, we'd spent on payroll replacement. So an eligible use in ARPA was rehiring of public sector capacity. So there was a formula based on how many FTEs you had, how many people you dedicated to the pandemic. And Vermont's pandemic response as a state, we were very robust. We reallocated a lot of staff within state government to work on COVID. And that was a number you were allowed to take credit for in your rehiring scheme. So we calculated the number of FTEs and we went through across multiple years and basically replaced the payroll, took the general funds that were freed up from those activities, and then put them back in the ARPA program. So the authority was net neutral for AOA, as in we could change the character of the money, but we could not change the amount of funding, and we could, of course, not change the rules that the state legislature set for those programs. So we swapped the funds, essentially. And that let us spend, as I said, just over $200 million out of the $1 billion in December, which pushed us forward to where we're now at just under 900 million out of the 1.05 billion expended. And we have another 21 months to spend. So we still have over $100 million at play. But for most of our programs, and what we did with some of our programs is we did partial swaps, where if they had 20 million, we looked at their projections for when they would finish. And some of them were like, oh man, we need to swap all your money. Like this is a risk to hit this deadline. And some of them, it's like, well, we'll swap 40% of your money so that you'll probably finish in 2026 at some point in early to mid. And so we are on an expenditure path. We jumped up very quickly in that one quarter. We can perform additional swaps. That net neutral transfer authority didn't end on December 31st. But after 12/31/2024, Treasury has kind of a process that they're paying a lot more attention to whenever you move money between projects. So it really needs to be worth it in order for us to move the money around. It'll be safer to leave it in place as long as things are going well. But any money that we move in ARPA in the next 2 years, it has to be between previously established projects. We can't create new projects. We can only finish what we started at this point. So we're in the 2-year taper for ARPA. So that is, I think, the general state of where we are with ARPA. We're in a pretty good place. We just completed the first quarter report for ARPA for Treasury just a couple days ago. It's actually due today. And we again showed full obligation of all funds, meaning we won't have to send anything back. When people get returns and other things, it actually has to happen within that same quarter. Because if we get money returned to us and we don't have another use immediately for that money and we have to report it to Treasury, their instructions right now are to send back anything that's unobligated at the end of each quarter. So they're really looking to recapture any bit of that money that they can. And my job will be to limit that as much as possible. With other programs like from pandemic era of emergency rental assistance and coronavirus relief fund, we did have returns come back to us after those programs had ended. And in those cases, we have no choice but to send the money back to the federal government because the period of performance has ended. And for whatever reason, a grant was returned or we finally recaptured an erroneous payment, et cetera. And in that case, we've had to send it back. But those amounts for CRF and emergency rental assistance have been really quite small at this point.
Any questions about Hannah? Thank you for your time and for the updates. I think it's really helpful to have a sense of both where the ARPA money is and was, especially with the questions about federal funding going forward. And also, I know that the MTAP program in some of my small communities was very helpful. Just sort of helping them figure out what they want to do, even because as we said, in some of the smallest communities, it's 3 volunteers. They just don't have the capacity to even think creatively because they're just so busy trying to keep the lights on in the town. So. Yeah.
So just to reiterate from my town, particularly Whitingham, they really appreciated your help. Continue to appreciate you.
Yeah, it's I think one of the biggest differences with MTAP from like the traditional RPC technical assistance, it's not the RPCs haven't wanted to do it this way, is that most of our funding comes with a specific program. And it's like, if you want to talk about this program or if you want to work on this program, we'll help you. And sometimes it's like, we'll only help you once you actually get the grant, get the project, right? So it's like, well, how do we do all the work to even get the grant? And it's like, well, that's on you. So in this program, we were willing to have those conversations about, okay, what do you actually want to do? And does that fit in any of these lanes? And if someone was like, no, it absolutely doesn't fit in any of those lanes, then we had to end the conversation. But if it was like, well, it's kind of like this, it's partly a housing project. It's like, well, then let's talk about that partly. Let's see how much of it can be housing. And I think a lot of towns really appreciated that approach of just being able to talk through what they wanted to do with an expert at the RPCs that was, and that was most of who carried the water on the direct technical assistance was the RPCs. And it's an activity, like I said, that they've wanted to do, but they didn't have the funding to go out and just have those ground sourcing type conversations. And so I think for towns like Whitingham, it was really productive. I think the frustrating part for all of us is that, we want to see a list of finished projects from that money. And some of these are going to take 5 to 10 years. But I think starting those projects and giving that community a sense of progress is actually much more impactful and meaningful to people staying in that town and living in that town. You need a direction. You need to feel some progress, and especially some of these smaller communities when they're not able to get anything off the ground and they're just stuck and they see other towns, doing these big projects. I think that's part of what we were reacting to as well.
That's been a point of mine for quite a long time. I'm from Bethel, and Bethel was a very depressed town for about 60 years, and the important pieces were things that just gave it hope, right? And just some little thing that somebody can see a future that's different than today. Really in my town, really sort of changed the whole, feeling and thoughts around the town. And so then suddenly other people started having creative thoughts and a little bit of hope, and it really made a huge difference. So you're right, I think, just giving people just that much room to have that first dream of maybe we don't have to be a depressed little town. It is so meaningful, I think. So thank you. All right, thank you, yeah, for your time today. It's so Tim is not coming in at all. When's he coming?
Thanks so much.
He's coming, okay. So committee, we have until 10 o'clock, a little bit of free time